Hi, everybody. Welcome to our breakout session on queer students and schools. This is our second and final day of the IDRA EAC-South conference. I know that we're all processing a lot of information in these back-to-back sessions, and as we're reflecting on these ideas and taking in even more ideas, I just wanted to take a breath and share a few reminders before we power through the rest of the day and close out the week.
It's you I like. It's not the things you wear. It's not the way you do your hair. But it's you I like. The way you are right now. The way down deep inside you. Not the things that hide you. Not your toys. They're just beside you. But it's you.
You can do this. So my name is Irene Gómez, and I am a research engagement strategist at the Intercultural Development Research Association. As a queer Latina in the education field, I'm very happy in my role to focus on K-12 ethnic studies, student engagement, and LGBTQ+ student support. Today, we'll be talking about creating safe and inclusive classrooms with queer students. If you didn't guess, the kick butt kid up there is me, and she's up here to inspire some reflection on a quote that you may have heard before, which is, "Who were you before the world told you who to be?" During the session, we'll be discussing some big picture perspectives to support students as they shape their own futures. And if you're a student, I'm super excited you're here and hoping these strategies are useful for you to advocate for your and your loved ones' needs at school. You'll notice that we won't be spending too much time delving into detailed vocabulary or laws. Those are very important, and we do, as IDRA EAC-South, provide support to understand them. But this presentation focuses on lenses to analyze our work, and I've structured it this way, thinking about a queer scholar activist that I admire, Dr. Bettina Love, and she talks about how important it is, while doing justice work, to have some North Star philosophies. So these are like guiding compasses for the decisions that we make as leaders and community members. And I found that having these compasses or these lenses with which to look at our work can actually make it easier to digest the detailed vocabulary and the laws that we add to our toolbox as we keep learning and unlearning. So I won't be able to see too much of the chat during the presentation, but please feel free to write in there and ask questions in the Q&A tab while I'm talking. And then towards the end of the presentation, I'll be able to take a closer look. But we will start with the not so basic basics. What I've done here is I've boiled down what I consider to be the most important things educators should keep in mind when working with queer students before we get into some other frameworks. Many of the things on this slide may be familiar to you or just part of your lived experience. So if that's the case, just know we won't spend more than 5 minutes here. But if this information is newer to you, please don't fear that it's only 5 minutes. We offer pro bono additional guidance and support for these nuts and bolts. And directly after this session, Dr. Mauricio Vasquez can tell you more about those. So we can briefly start these basics with a definition. And LGBTQ+ or queer is an umbrella term that includes a variety of both genders and sexualities. So an oversimplified distinction is that gender is more about how you see yourself, and sexuality is who you may or may not like. So these are two different things. A book that I highly recommend is called Queer, A Graphic History. And this is a super awesome academic comic book. And I found something really useful from this book, which is on the second bullet. And it's a suggestion that the book has for thinking about gender and sexuality. So it says, for one, we all have bodies. We know that is true. Two, we might express our gender in certain ways in response or in resistance to societal standards. And three, you might be attracted sexually or romantically to certain kinds of people. Other than that, many other things can vary. And science actually agrees with this. So many scientists will tell you that in terms of sexuality or who you like, not being straight is a natural thing and just part of our diversity as a species. In terms of biological body parts, most people are born with one type of reproductive system or another, but the meaning and the categories that people create beyond that fact look pretty different throughout history and across cultures and people. So unwiring some of the black and white ways that we've been taught to see gender and sexuality can take time, but the super duper easiest way of approaching this, as you'll see in bullet 3, is just refer to people how they ask you to. You can do this with gender by asking people what pronouns they use so that you can make sure you're getting those right. That is pretty well taken. And with sexual orientation, that's a more personal thing that you might not ask just anyone about, but there are ways to help people feel more comfortable to open up. One of those ways, as we see in the 4th bullet, is to interrupt bias early. At early ages, we can interrupt patterns of talking about things like boy colors versus girl colors, or who gets to play with dresses and dolls. And this is really important as a prevention strategy to get ahead of bullying that can happen in the future. We can also interrupt at early ages by modeling gender-neutral language when possible. So some gender-neutral words you might use at school could be y'all, or parent, caregiver, student, etc. We can also think about interrupting bias early in the school year. So one example would be on the first day of school, some teachers include a pronoun section in student about me forms. And this pronoun section might ask, are these the pronouns that you want me to use around your friends or around your parents? Let me know if you want to talk more about this, right? So some students might feel comfortable sharing with their teachers or their friends, but not with their families. And this pronoun section is a really good example, again, in this 4th bullet, of respecting autonomy by not sharing personal information that students trust you with. Respecting autonomy also extends to civil rights. So some legal protections that trans students have in the US related to this autonomy is using the restrooms and joining the sports teams that they want to. I'll quickly wrap up this slide because I have one main assumption about this audience, and it's that being at a conference about educational equity, you care about students and you want more of them to thrive. So congrats, that is the most important thing that you can do, is to care and to be kind. And that extends to yourself as we learn and unlearn. So if you are really trying and you make a mistake in your words or the way you approach a situation, have grace with yourself, apologize, thank them for the correction, and keep going, keep learning. The most essential piece is that you already care about their well-being and you hope they'll be happy. So we all want students to be well, and we all want students to lead meaningful lives. How do we do that? Let's keep going and reflect on what lies beyond the basics. One important way to offer high quality support to queer students is to really understand intersectionality. This is a term that's become popular through the work of Dr. Kimberly Crenshaw, and what it means is that certain groups of people don't experience societal hardships the same way. So let's use the example of people who are LGBTQ+. I am a queer woman and a child of Venezuelan immigrants. I could have grown up in the same neighborhood as another queer woman who is a child of Venezuelan immigrants, but is also Black and trans, and the world would likely react very differently to us. We both may encounter societal challenges for who we like and where our families are from, but I do not experience transphobia or anti-Black racism. So unfortunately, the stigmas and the stereotypes that humans create have very real consequences for people through policy and practice, and they can affect the material realities for groups. You'll hear extensively during this conference discussions about systemic inequities. As you know, these systems can affect access to housing, healthcare, education, income, and safety for queer people on multiple fronts. So we will hear right now from Dr. Sean Ginwright, who is thinking about how inequitable systems cause trauma for youth in intersectional ways. And he stresses that we can build on trauma-informed care to tap into a more expansive fullness, a fuller approach, right, in working with students, and especially starting with grown-ups. And he's going to share a big picture lens that I think can be incredibly useful for this work, and it's called Healing-Centered Engagement. And I've been having some technical difficulties, so hopefully this works.
It's you I like. It's not
not that one. This one. Okay. So here is Dr. Sean Ginwright.
Trauma-informed care tends to presume that the adult doesn't need to be healed, right? And that means that we have to think about healing as adults, that in order for us to provide profound healing opportunities, for us to provide the kind of supports that young people need, we also have to create supports for ourselves. That is, how do we begin to heal ourselves, to heal our own communities in the process of transforming the lives of young people? So we call that process healing, a shift from trauma-informed care to healing-centered engagement. And healing-centered engagement is a process that allows us to think differently about how the utility of our programs and saturating young people with opportunities to heal from their exposure to social toxicity.
And then there's one more excerpt from this speech that I think is really great.
When we talk about healing-centered engagement, it is dream-driven. That means that we talk about what are the dreams and aspirations young people want? What are the assets they bring into our youth development programs? And we begin to create opportunities for them to have an imagination about their lives so that they can begin to move forward in a positive way.
So when we are building spaces of belonging, and we understand that one, there's no universal queer experience. Different queer students are uniquely affected by many different systems of policy and practice that can be harmful. And we also understand too, that we're wondering how to lead through healing-centered engagement that not only won't further that harm, but will help students dream and grow. A critical piece of healing-centered engagement is adult reflection and action. So this requires giving educators and staff the space to take care of themselves and each other so that they can build meaningful and trusting relationships with students that focus on the student's strengths in a culturally sustaining way. So that's putting a lot of different ideas from the conference and conversation with each other. I want to note that there is a group of adults that is uniquely positioned to support queer youth, and these are queer educators. I've been to many different trainings that teach people how to advocate for queer youth, and a form of advocacy that I don't hear about enough in these trainings is how to support queer educators. So we'll hear in just a minute from an educator in the South who grappled with navigating how much of himself to bring into his work.
My own personal story involves me going back in the closet when I came to Texas, which was an incredibly difficult experience. I'm much better about talking about it now than I was then. And it's one of the hardest things that I've had to admit is that part of why I left teaching was because I was tired of being back in the closet. Now I'm the principal and I get to create and dismantle, lots of things all together, but that was not who I was and where I was when I first came to Texas, because I was afraid of not being able to do my work simply because I dreaded the thought of being called into the principal's office. But I also dreaded the day-to-day heteronormativity that I experienced. Oh, quiero que conozcas a mi prima. Mi hija. I want to introduce you to my daughter. And constantly having to say, I'm busy lesson planning. And it was a joke then, but it isn't a joke. We do experience those types of things that are more heteronormative than we should. But I ultimately chose myself over, the work that I did. And that was really heartbreaking for me. Now I got to come back to it. And it was because of the encouragement of my husband, who said, David, there needs to be principals like you. People need to see people like you in these spaces leading. And I'm really grateful to be in a school district, and I put it in the chat, that expanded its non-discrimination policy, because policy matters, words matter, and us being able to accept ourselves fully in these spaces comes from all these different things that factor into how we show up in this work.
So if your district is really getting serious about advocating for queer youth, training staff and hiring consultants is critical. And caring for queer educators must be part of that commitment without placing an additional burden on them. So this looks like asking, How are we supporting queer staff? Or what do we as queer staff need from our district to do our jobs better? There is an awesome coalition of trans educators in Colorado that put together a list of practical steps on how to do this. And we'll hear a little bit from them right now.
Official policy that takes care of both transgender students and staff is really important. Changing name on documents and information systems can be world-changing professionally for transgender teachers, educators, everyone within the district, especially things like email, where you're in communication with your coworkers and you maybe don't want to be out as your dead name, and you want to make sure that you are having a professional relationship without that being something that gets in the way of your communication. Dead naming is using a name that was given at birth that somebody chooses not to use anymore. It can sometimes out someone who otherwise was not open as transgender. Being dead named opens a lot of doors for uncomfortable, intimate conversations that a lot of people don't want to have. It'd be really important to have a model policy to go off of, largely because it can be exhausting to reinvent the wheel. You know, if there's already options out there that you can use to help you kind of figure out what you need, that helps make sure that you have all your bases covered, that helps make sure that you don't have to take all the stress of trying to be the expert on something. Toronto, Chicago, and LA Unified are a few model policies that already have the language for updating names on data systems and for including staff as well as students in their policies. Every day I'm living proof to my students that it's possible to be happy, healthy, successful, living trans adults. I know this generation of young people is going to grow up with a different idea of what's possible for a trans person.
What I love about this video is that it centers happiness and well-being. I feel a lot of times narratives about queer people are super focused on bullying and harassment, which is totally real. We don't want that to happen. But keeping in mind healing-centered engagement, we can make room for more narratives, which is that historically, many queer people are extremely creative and resourceful and have a lot to share that is not rooted only in pain. So in an ideal scenario, as staff are trained and supported, you can also start looking into content, student engagement, and other asset-based resources that you can provide for young people. I think it's really exciting to think about all of the possible overlaps for engaging queer students. Because we are in your classes, even if we don't tell you. So I went to a rural high school in Texas, which was considerably homophobic and transphobic. I can only think of 3 people who were openly queer throughout my entire 4 years. Lo and behold, we graduate, and I now know of so many different people, including myself, who had not shared or even come to terms with ourselves because of the environment that we were in. I remember in 12th grade, we read a book with a queer main character in it, and I was so intrigued that our English teacher made no big deal about it. So if a school can create cohesion across classes, showing that they value queer people enough to include them in every subject, I know that would have made a big difference for me. So what can that look like in different subjects? I saw a very interesting webinar the other day about queer curriculum for English learner or emergent bilingual students. And so they were kind of going into, for example, in Spanish, there's been more of a push to create gender neutral language. As a lot of you know, Spanish is a very gendered language with different adjectives and nouns. So that's been interesting for me to learn about and employ in my language. And I think that can also be something for students to be aware about in their first language or one of the many languages that they speak. Another thing that in this webinar that I thought was interesting is they said that a lot of times the physical violence that students experience will begin with linguistic violence. So it begins with insults and bias and all of that. So and that can happen in several languages. So that's one way. Another way that we can think about incorporating queer communities in our classroom content is in health and science, right? This is something that has been very important for advocates is in sex education. A lot of times that is not inclusive. It's very much only focusing on heterosexual relationships, and that is a public health issue for students if they don't have that access to information. So that's another way to talk about that. And even what I was mentioning earlier, right, about how literally most scientists will tell you that we are just a diverse species with different attractions and different ways of being in the world. In history and ethnic studies, so a lot of my focus in my work has been in ethnic studies, and I love the intersection of thinking about, for example, for Pride Month, that originated with a lot of queer activists who were Black and Latine. So Latine is one of those things, going back to language, that is a gender neutral alternative to Latino. So there are Black and Latine activists like Marsha P. Johnson and Sylvia Rivera, who were instrumental to the marches for queer liberation that have now turned into the Pride Month that we celebrate every year in June. And there are other historical figures that are popular, but sometimes they are that aspect of their identity of being queer is not highlighted. So that can be something that to talk about in history and ethnic studies classes. Participatory action research is something that you might hear about during this conference that I think could be really great for students who want to learn more about their literal queer community and the people around them, right? So like in their geographic location, what has been that history, and kind of like interviewing different people in the area, or looking at different statistics and figures. So, excuse me, participatory action research and project-based learning go really hand in hand together to allow students to have agency over the content that they're learning about, and also helping them develop skills like interviewing, like research and analysis, and writing for different audiences, and presenting, right? If they want to have some action items that come out of the research that they do together or individually. Sometimes that research leads to, and oftentimes we would want the research to lead into action. So another way, like around the school, to show support for queer students is to really invest in gay straight alliances and other groups that are advocating for queer students. This can also be seen in student advisory boards, where you solicit the participation from queer students to make sure that they're being represented in decisions that are happening in the school. Some public-facing resources can also be helpful around the school to show students that you are in solidarity with them. So in the webinar that I showed earlier with the Queer Educators Speak, they were talking about having, Happy Pride Month on their marquee outside of the school, and having lanyards that show that, have like the rainbow flag, or having it in your classroom too, right? These are very, very simple ways of just kind of like normalizing and showing a solid front, a collective front with the adults in the school that they care for queer students. And then that also leads into mental health initiatives, right? Like mental health issues are queer issues. We want to start at the root, right? So back to the slide that I mentioned, where we're going to be interrupting early, we're going to be continuing to learn. But as society catches up with the way that we're trying to build a new world together, it's also important to have that mental health support, because there are a lot of people, unfortunately, who are homophobic and who are transphobic. So that is important for counselors to receive very in-depth training. I mean, it like I was saying earlier, it takes time to learn these things and learn to do them well. And again, you want your heart to be in the right place, but it also requires that intellectual you got to commit to it, right? So for counselors, that's really important to have several different kinds of training if they're not already well versed in working with queer communities. And that can also look like social emotional learning, right? Social emotional learning can also be a queer issue, because in social emotional learning, you're learning how to collaborate with people. And recently, with social emotional learning, there's been a bigger push to consider SEL in a more systemic way. So to make sure that we consider, as Dr. Ginwright was talking about, the outside factors that can make navigating the world difficult, that are not our fault, and how are we going to support each other as we move through that together. The other thing to remember is that you don't have to do this alone as a school, right? So hiring consultants, right, is important, but you can also work with family members and parents of queer students who would be excited to help develop initiatives in the community. There are often community-based organizations that work with queer youth, and nonprofits that work with queer youth that may have different handbooks available, different programming, and that could become partnerships that you have during school or after school, or even just having students be aware of those on the website. So here, when we're talking about the public-facing resources, right, that can be one of those public-facing resources, and sharing different scholarship information and the like. There are also queer centers at universities that I think they would be very excited to partner with districts. So there's a lot of professors there that can help with developing the curriculum that we were talking about, and the various initiatives that you might want to roll out at your school. So right there within your community, I'm sure that there are a lot of professors and even student organizations at the college level who would be happy to provide mentorship and guidance for those. So also, I would be super interested in hearing some of your suggestions in the chat if you have engaged in some of these community partnerships in your district, or any other ideas you have for working with queer students. So before I wrap up, I just wanted to touch on some tensions. I know that depending on your district, you may not be able to do all of these things at once, right? It can be a challenge, right? Like if you are in a district like the one where I went to high school, I think there would be some resistance from parents about indoctrination and the like. So I think that, again, focusing on the rights that students have, right, that they are legally entitled, but also going beyond that in your commitment, and just saying that, we want all students to thrive, and that includes queer students. And so this is part of engaging queer students and supporting them and our staff, right? And I also wanted to name another tension is that with the intersectionality aspect, it's important to keep considering what narratives we aren't hearing about. So for example, you'll notice in the videos that I shared, a lot of the people are masculine presenting. And I did a lot of research, and in the future, we'll be incorporating even more people, right? In this presentation, you heard from Black leaders, from Asian leaders, from trans leaders, but again, mostly masculine presenting. And so I think that's an interesting thing that I found, right, in kind of like who gets highlighted and who gets spotlighted in the resources that are public facing. So even that can kind of show some bias towards people. So I think it's important to keep digging and to keep promoting different points of view, and especially the ones that are most marginalized. So that is kind of where I'm at, right? And sharing what I know, and then some of the questions that I've had for myself and how I want to continue my work. So I can now check out the chat and any Q&A. Thanks for the compliments, y'all. And yeah, just I'll give a few minutes to see if people have things to share, any thoughts, questions about what we just discussed. Thank you, cheerleaders in the chat. Super appreciate it. So if you don't have any questions, I guess we can wrap up the session early, and just wanted to thank you so much for coming. But I will stick around in case. I know that it's a little bit difficult with this platform because you can't unmute yourself. So if you're still writing, I will be here to answer or engage with anything that you want to share in the chat. But otherwise, I hope that you have a great rest of your day and are ready for all of the rest of the information that you will be reflecting on through this conference. Thank you. Okay, I was looking for the file, but any books that I would recommend. So thank you, Christy, for putting in there Queer: A Graphic History. I think that is just a phenomenal resource. Like, it's so comprehensive and really fun just to like read through it. So it covers, you know, the history of like how the word queer has evolved. It also talks about what different scholars, like there's a lot of scholars that actually kind of disagree with each other. And I think there's just a lot of great resources in that book. There's another book that I have been reading. I think it's called Rethinking Gender, Sexuality. Let me check what it's called. Rethinking. Anyway, it's from Rethinking Schools. Yes, and it's called Rethinking Sexism, Gender, and Sexuality. And so I got that recommendation from one of my professors in grad school. We call her Gretchen. So I actually, her last name, she hasn't told us how to pronounce her last name. Her name is Dr. Gretchen Brion Measles. She is a phenomenal queer educator as well. And she hosted a class called Queering Education. And that is the main text that she went off of. But I also really like to watch YouTube videos. So, you know, like I mentioned a few panels in here, there's the Queer Educators Speak panel. There is the one for emergent bilingual students. I can drop that in the chat. I think it's this one. Let me double check. Yes. Okay. So this is a panel of teachers who teach English, and they talk about how to incorporate LGBTQ students in the curriculum. I also really enjoy on Twitter. I like to keep up with different queer researchers and queer centers. So I'll just type in, right, like queer on the Twitter search bar, and there's like a ton of people that come up who share different articles and different collaboratives that they're a part of. So if you would like to follow me, you can creep on the people that I follow, because there's a lot of really, really great scholars and activists on there. So here's my Twitter handle. Yes, Christy has shared some podcasts that IDRA offers. Thank you for adding that, Christy. And we are also working at IDRA EAC-South to develop some additional resources like briefs and other things that we can share in the future. So we're super excited to do that. And now I will go back to looking for the file for the handouts so that you can look at the slides. Amanda, did you have another question? I see you're raising your hand, so thank you, Michelle. And I am now uploading to our handouts the PowerPoint or the presentation. All right, so all uploaded, and if you have no more questions, I'll just give you a minute to download the slides, and then we can close out.